Okay, welcome, and today we're going to talk about curse words. I should really be editing this video and like putting a bleep in every time I say bullshit, because that would be funny. But I won't, because this is serious academic work that we're doing here. Okay, so today's agenda, going to talk about what is bullshit, what both Ludlow and Frankfurt take bullshit to be, and maybe give some kind of tips on what we ought to do to constructively deal with it. Hopefully, maybe I can help you out with that a little bit, because they didn't really have a lot of practical kind of stuff, so maybe I can add to that, to the reading, to give you something useful to take with you. All right, so first question, just a little bit of engagement material here for you. When do you imagine that Frankfurt, or the first one, the one that Frankfurt wrote about on bullshit, when do you imagine that was written? And the cheat hint that I have here is that it was not written in 2005, as you might have seen if you Google it or something like that. That's not the right answer. So you can pause the video right now and post your comments. Try and keep it all in one thread and see if anybody can suss out when this would actually be, when this would be ready. And we can do like Price is Right rules on, closest to the correct year without going too far into the past is the winner. I don't know what you get when you win, but try and do some guesses in the comments, and we'll stop the thread when somebody actually gets the exact right year or super close to it. Okay? All right. So continuing on, I'm going to spoil it now. So if you go back and don't be a jerk and post the right answer, because I'm just now going to tell it to you, right? But it's 1986. Okay? That's how long ago that was written, when he was lamenting about the volume and difficulty of dealing with bullshit. And I think I'd have to agree with him as someone who was a little bit alive in 1986 and somewhat aware of the world around me. There was bullshit, but it's worse now. Thanks, Internet, right? So why didn't his paper, and it was originally a paper written in an academic journal, then republished as a standalone book, because in academic papers it's a nice short book, but it got, because it was written accessibly and on a kind of a pretty sexy topic, it got some play, and so they republished it as an actual book, and so it got some popularity. And you can see, if you Google for Frankfurt on bullshit, you'll see that there have been many reactions to it. And it's kind of stimulated a lot of conversation, not just in the academic sphere, but in kind of the regular public as well. But yeah, he was writing this in 1986. And it hasn't got better. Hasn't had maybe the salutary effect. He didn't solve anything. Sometimes philosophy takes a couple thousand years to take effect. But the core insight that he was trying to get at here was, he was trying to, as philosophers do, right, trying to prize apart and find distinctions between concepts, to try and refine concepts, to help us think about them better, to come to better mental grip on particular concepts so we can deal with them better. His main goal in his paper was to contrast bullshit and bullshitting with lies and lying, because he thought there was a really important distinction to be made, that you shouldn't be mixing those two words up, right? And the thing that he hung his hat on was that he said liars need to have some acquaintance with at least what they think the truth is, right? They have to have some concern, some awareness for the truth. Now, a liar can still kind of like get things wrong, right? And lie poorly, right? But at least part of their job as being a liar involves trying to distract someone from the truth. You can't mislead someone on anything unless there's a thing that you don't want them to find, right? And that's what liars are doing. They have something they think is the truth, and they are lying in order to divert attention away from that thing that they think is the truth. They might be wrong about that thing being the truth, but that's what that to him is definitive of liars. And so liars, you can't lie unless you think you know the truth. Right? So if you're completely ignorant about something and you don't know what's correct, you can't lie. You can make something up, though. And that's where bullshitting comes in, right? For Frankfurt, the distinguishing feature of bullshit, right, is that it gets produced without concern for the truth. Without concern. So that doesn't mean that everything that is bullshit is wrong or false. Stuff that people say as bullshit could be true. A variety of bullshit, I might argue, is propaganda, right? We're all familiar with propaganda. Unfortunately, think about current events and different ways people spin stuff. When governments try and spin stuff, that we usually call that propaganda, right? Now, we usually point out propaganda and call out stuff as propaganda when we think it's actually false, right? But not all propaganda is false, and not all propaganda is a lie, right? The people who create the propaganda, or the people who disseminate it or perpetuate it, pass it on, might themselves think that it is true, right? But the reason why it's propaganda is not because it's false, it's because it's spin, right? Because it's being done really without any essential concern for the truth. That is, propaganda has a different goal than sharing what the speaker thinks is the truth to other people, right? Propaganda has as a goal to get people to think a certain way about that particular topic, right? So if you think about a war and two sides in a war, they're both going to have interests to present the war a certain way to the larger international audience, to their own internal people, right? Because they want to keep morale up, because they want the international community on their side, right? Now, some wars are just bad wars, and both aggressors are, you might think, in the wrong and not doing the right thing, and so neither side can, have any sort of credible narrative that they are on the side of right and justice and peace and all those kinds of things. Or you could have a war where you think it's pretty clear that one side is the unjust aggressor and the other side is just merely defending itself, right? But in either case, both governments are going to be putting out propaganda. They're going to be putting out news articles. They're going to be putting out videos. They're going to be putting out statistics or expert testimony, testifying to how they want the war to be viewed. It could be that one of those sides is doing that by telling the truth, what they think is the truth, but maybe also like what actually is the truth, what actually has real, credible, and good evidence behind it, right? That's still propaganda, right? And while it might be true, the people at least creating that propaganda aren't doing it for the primary purpose of sharing the truth. They may say they're doing that. They may say, we just want the truth to come out, right? But that's not really why they're doing it. They're doing it to get the international community on their side, or to keep up the morale of their troops or their citizens or whoever it is up, to help make sure that the war effort is maintained or improved, something like that. So propaganda, on Frankfurt's definition, is a kind of BS, right? It's produced without concern for the truth, but it could be true, right? So both sides propaganda. Bullshit. Okay? Now, does that mean bullshit is necessarily bad? Frankfurt has an opinion on that, right? Frankfurt thinks bullshit is worse than lying. But I want to know about what you guys think. Think about cases of bullshitting and think about cases of lying. And remember, for Frankfurt, those are very different kinds of things, right? Being a bullshitter is different than being a liar, right? An instance of bullshit is different than an instance of lying, right? A lie, a statement that is untrue, is different than a bullshit, a statement that is, phony or not even false, as he says, right? Which one of those is worse? And what I want you to do is I want you to think about that judgment, that ranking of bullshit and lying, both for the person who is hearing it, but also for the person who is saying it. Is it bad for, so not only do I want you to think about whether a bullshit is worse than lying for the person hearing it, but I want you to think about which one's worse for the person saying it. So post that stuff in the comments, and let's see if people have any kind of good examples or strong opinions backed up with some good reasons about which one of those two is worse. what I'm going to do now, after I've given you that fraction of a second to pause the video and state your case, is continue on to what Frankfurt thinks. Frankfurt thinks that bullshit is clearly and unambiguously worse than lying. And the reason why I think so is should remind you a little bit of W.K. Clifford and his that first reading, that first topic that we had video lectures and a reading on, where he was talking about the real wrong of the ship owner. It's not that they're immoral, that they killed people. That's all kind of secondary stuff. I mean, it's not nothing, right? But for Clifford, the problem was the way that ship owner adopted that belief, the process by which he came to believe something that was against an objective look at the evidence, right? And Frankfurt, I think, has a very similar attitude here. This is why he thinks bullshitting is worse than lying, right? He thinks, look, at least the liar, even though they're committing a moral wrong and they're trying to mislead people, and that's bad, right? At least they are doing that in a world where they are aware of and concerned about the truth. Now, the morally bad part is that they are only aware of it so they can avoid it or try and get other people to miss it, right? But he thinks that bullshitting is worse because the bullshitter is living in a world, has an attitude that doesn't even think that the truth is a thing. That it's not a matter of concern, that the bullshitter is saying the things they're saying and the truth is irrelevant to what they pick to say. Their only concern is to say things that accomplish some goal, right? To get you, to manipulate you into doing something that they want you to do. And whether what they have to say to get you to do that is the truth or a lie doesn't matter. So they don't even pay attention to whether the things they say are true or false. And so Frankfurt thinks, kind of like Clifford, right? Every time you do that, for Clifford, it's every time you choose to believe stuff that doesn't have sufficient evidence to justify its belief, you're corroding your character, right? Frankfurt thinks a pretty similar thing about bullshit. Every time you bullshit, right, you train yourself, you get into a habit of not caring about the truth. Every time you lie, it's still bad, but you're maintaining that care and respect for what is true, at least to a certain extent, right? I mean, you're disrespecting the truth because you choose to not share it, right? Because you choose to lie instead and be dishonest, right? But at least, says Frankfurt, the liar knows what the truth is. And the liar, by lying, is not corroding their ability to determine the truth, to detect it, to see where it is. Whereas he thinks that bullshitters, habitual bullshitters, will gradually, through lack of use, get worse at determining what the truth is. The more comfortable they are with bullshit, the less comfortable and familiar and skillful they will be at actually figuring out what the truth is. The truth will matter less to them in everything that they do, just like what Clifford was saying about forming beliefs ethically, right? So there's some echoes of Clifford in Frankfurt here. So you might disagree with that, but that's Frankfurt's view, and it's okay for you to disagree with that. Totally your call. Now, as a consequence of that, right, Frankfurt has this idea, right, that explains why even back in 1986 there was so much bullshit. And I think if you're an older person taking this course and you remember 86 or you remember the 90s or the 2000s or something like that, and you weren't like 10 years old, right, or less, there was bullshit hanging around there, and we had public figures or other people who were expected to say things on topics that they really didn't have any knowledge about. That's even worse now, I might argue, because of the internet and social media. We not only have that thing going on, but we also have a lot of opportunity for people who have no particular expertise to spout off about stuff, and to do it outside of areas of expertise they have, if any. I mean, it's worse now because now people are kind of famous and listened to without having any established expertise, right? I'm talking about, your Instagram influencers or things like that, right? There are people who rise to prominence on social media not for any kind of expertise, but for entertainment value or engagement value or something like that. And sometimes the algorithms boost their profile specifically for those things, right? And so they are regularly called upon or incentivized through the rewards of interaction, right, of engagement, because they get a revenue on it, to say things on topics for which they have no particular expertise. And Frankfurt is saying that, look, that's ripe circumstances. That's circumstance where either you're a politician or you're a celebrity of some other thing, and you get a reporter sticking a microphone in your face and asking you a question for which you don't immediately know the topic, but there's pressure there for you to say something definitive, something authoritative, right? That's saying, let me circle back, or let me get back to you when I learn more about that, would not be a good look for you, right? That's when you have this pretty overwhelming urge, maybe you might even argue an obligation, to throw some bullshit out, right? To kind of satisfy, and then maybe you can, if you care about the truth, right, come back later and fill in more details, or at least come in with a non-bullshit answer, right? But often the way that things operate right now, it's you ask somebody once, and then you get the bullshit, and then the microphone goes away, and you don't have time to kind of improve on that, right? It's kind of rare that people will then be like, yeah, no, actually I did some more thinking after that person asked me that stuff. I like to refine my viewpoint. I'd like to, say I learned more and here's my updated view, or anything like that. But usually because of us, because of the recipients of that kind of information, we're satisfied, right? We don't demand people kind of follow up and do their homework and stuff. Or we're not satisfied when people give a response that's equivalent to, yeah, I don't think I'm not ready to give you an answer on that, right? Come back to me in a couple days, or come back to me next month when I can have my organization, or I can do some research myself, or consult with some experts and tell you what I really think about this, because nobody likes to look unprepared, right? So that's the risk, right? That we have a ton of situations in modern life that seem to be these kinds of circumstances where we expect, or maybe even require, someone to talk about something in an authoritative and knowledgeable fashion without being authoritative or knowledgeable. So, that's partial explanation for why there's so much bullshit, and why there's maybe more now in the 2020s than there was in the 1980s. Now, the second half of this reading, well, more than a half, right? The Frankfurt's pretty short, is the Ludlow stuff, right? Where he is reacting to and trying to update and expand on Frankfurt's theory of bullshit, right? Ludlow thinks Frankfurt totally underestimated, both back in 1986 and currently, about bullshit. And he's kind of basing this on observing that Frankfurt's definition of bullshit is pretty specific and doesn't really track with how people use the word in ordinary language. Sometimes when people use the word bullshit, they're using it in Frankfurt's sense. But he points out there's a whole bunch of other times when people call things bullshit that just don't seem to fit Frankfurt's usage, Frankfurt's definition, Frankfurt's concept of bullshit. And for Ludlow, what that means is Frankfurt's concept isn't big enough, right? Isn't expansive enough. There is another possibility, and that is that Frankfurt has it right, and there is this true usage of bullshit, and whenever you see those other uses of people in ordinary life using the term bullshit, they're just using it wrong, right? But Ludlow thinks, no, there's some pretty consistent usages out there, and people seem to recognize other people using the term bullshit in those circumstances and not kind of scratching their head and saying, don't you mean lying, or don't you mean this or that instead of bullshit? No, people accept it when other people call out other stuff as bullshit that doesn't fit Frankfurt's definition. So that's Ludlow saying, hey, there must be other varieties of bullshit out there that Frankfurt didn't talk about yet. So let me see if let me take a crack at it, right? He thinks that the theory of bullshit actually has much more, has 4 other parts possibly, right? So he thinks that Frankfurt's definition, right, is focusing on just the first item in this list, right? Now, where did he get these items? Well, he got at least the starting bits from this guy called Grice, a philosopher of language. That is, a philosopher who studies the concepts and nature of language, of communication between people, right? And Grice has, as most philosophers of language are signed onto this, that language is a lot more than words and spelling and dictionaries and things like that. It's a lot more than kind of the explicit rules and grammar and definitions of words and how they fit together into meaningful sentences. But there's a whole world of other kinds of things that help make language communicative to us, even when that language that we express is ungrammatical. It still can be meaningful, right? Even when the language that we have isn't language at all, but unspoken gestures, those are still communicative and, in a sense, are language and have a grammar to them and have meaning to particular gestures. And those aren't fixed, right? A particular word doesn't mean the same thing every time it gets uttered. So how do we figure all that stuff out? How do we know what a word really means in a particular context? That's what philosophers of language that's one of the things they try and figure out. What are all these rules that we all, as at least native or long-term speakers of a particular language, what do we get? What do we understand beyond just words and their definitions and grammar that helps us communicate well with one another? What can we learn from mistakes or miscommunications in the use of language? And how does that reveal how language is supposed to work, right? Because looking at failures can tell you a lot about how things are supposed to work. And so one of Grice's maxims of communication is the maxim of quality, right? That you want to communicate what you have evidence for. And that's the one that Ludlow says, that's the sense of bullshit that Frankfurt is picking out. Frankfurt's type of bullshit is when people say things without regard to evidence, without regard to the truth. They're violating the maxim of quality. But there are other maxims, right? The maxim of quantity, don't say more or less than is necessary, right? And Ludlow gives us examples of when people kind of add way too much information or not enough. There's the maxim of relation, right? And so that's kind of like our relevance evaluation, right? You don't talk about things that are not relevant to the issue at hand, right? You start talking about things that are true but not relevant. That's bullshit, right? The maximum of manner, if you are saying things that are just kind of disorganized, so it's hard for the listener to pick out the parts that are useful or relevant to what they're doing, then that's violating the maximum manner. And then he proposes later on in the reading there that we need to have a maximum of respect. That is, we need to be respectful in a kind of both an emotional and kind of politeness sense, but also in a sense of respecting their time and energy and intellect, and not treat them like idiots or not treat them like patsies or tools or those kinds of things as well. And that bullshit happens each and every time. The different variety of bullshit happens each and every time you violate one of these maxims or norms, right? He does say in there, and I think I kept it in the excerpts that I plucked out, because the original paper, you can follow the link, is longer than what I had you guys read, that writing can be communicative by violating norms like these. So comedy often intentionally violates one or more of these maxims to elicit a comic effect, right? To get laughs. Poetry or art or other kinds of things like that play around with these norms to try and evoke reactions or emotional responses or other kinds of things, right? That's all usual. So not all norms violations of language, of communication, are bullshit, right? So this Ludlow wants to say, you might not be convinced, but he wants to say that not every time you violate some norms of communication is that an instance of bullshit. It's just these ones right here. And I think that Frankfurt probably would agree with that, at least to a little extent, because I think he would say still the essence of bullshit, right, isn't just that you're violating the maxim of quality, but that you're interfering with the norms of communication in such a way as to make it hard for the listener to determine what is true, right? And that could be something as simple as violating the maxim of manner and being so disorganized in your presentation that it's hard for someone to follow and pick out, even if everything you said was true and relevant, right? For someone to reconstruct your chain of reasoning, right? To follow what you were saying, right? And so that's, especially if you're doing it intentionally, to kind of obscure or manipulate or get other people to think certain things. You may not be lying, right? But you're certainly violating norms here in an effort to obscure or do away with concern for the truth, right? So I think even though Frankfurt would probably agree, yeah, I was concerned about number one there, I think he would still want to press the point that the essence of bullshit is a disregard for the truth. So how do we deal with this stuff? Well, I think Ludlow has a couple things there. He's mostly complaining. Frankfurt is mostly complaining as well about all these people, right? But Frankfurt does give us that one thing, right, which is to be aware of those circumstances where us or somebody else calls upon another person to say something that they're really not qualified or prepared to say. That's an instance where you should expect some bullshit to be happening, right? But if you look at those maxims and you ask yourself, hey, are there circumstances where even kind of maybe honest and sincere people could be put in situations where they're going to violate those norms of communication? Yeah, maybe, right? And so your job might be to make sure that when those circumstances occur, that you kind of realize it and you go, I should be more careful in accepting what people say in this circumstance, because it might be bullshit, right? I should maybe not try and put other people in such circumstances because all I'm doing is inviting bullshit, right? So, for instance, if you're a journalist or a reporter and you stick a microphone in somebody's face with a gotcha question, okay, fine, maybe that's what you were after, right? But if you're just asking somebody, hey, what do you think about X issue, or how are you going to vote on this bill, or what do you think about this terrible event that just happened? Isn't that terrible, and what should we do about it? Be accepting if that person says, man, I haven't had enough time to think it through. Get back to me in a day, right? Okay, follow them up with that, right? But you shouldn't categorize that kind of response. You shouldn't put that kind of response in the same bucket as no comment or they ran away from me or something like that, which we kind of sometimes see in journalism, right? So if you don't want to invite bullshit upon yourself and the people around you, try not to put people in situations that are bullshit promoting, right? Because even good people will bullshit if the circumstances force them to. You might argue that no one's ever forced to bullshit, right? But certainly encouraged to bullshit by the circumstances, right? We've all been in those kind of situations, right? Now, how should you deal with that? That's one way to deal with it, right? I think probably it's different dealing with liars than with bullshitters, though part of the difference between bullshit and lying is the intent of the speaker. And it can sometimes be really hard to determine what the person's intent is. Was their intent to mislead me from a truth that they think they know? Or was their intent to just mess with the norms of communication so that they can manipulate me into doing something else? Because both liars and bullshitters are manipulators, right? And even, how do I distinguish bullshitters and liars from people who are just ignorant or mistaken? That is, they're sincere, but they just believe something false, right? You want to deal with those people differently than either bullshitters or liars. But if all it is intent, and it's difficult to figure out what the intent of the person you're talking to is, then it might be hard to kind of deal distinctly with bullshitters or liars. Two popular possibilities are just to kind of walk away, to disengage with the person, right? And, that can be an acceptable response in lots of situations. Somebody's feeding you bullshit. You particularly know that person is not, because they're norm breaking when it comes to communication. What that means is they're not really interested in the kind of communication about the topic that you are interested in communicating about, And if that's true, why are you still communicating? Why are you still talking, discussing with that person who, through their bullshit, is demonstrating to you that they are not interested in having that conversation with you, right? So bullshit, more than lying, might be something you might choose to walk away from. But on the other hand, if you are an expert, as you guys are learning more about bullshit and lying and critical thinking and determining the truth and those kinds of things, you might, in a particular kind of group dynamic, be one of the more capable people in the group of critical thinking, of identifying bullshit, of identifying lies. So even though it might be best for you just to walk away and go, this person's not interested in the truth, if there are other people involved who you might worry about, maybe you need to stick into that conversation and call out the bullshit or call out the lies. Now, I think we've learned a little bit about bullshit such that we know that there might be better or worse ways to call something out. It's often not going to be great just to kind of point a finger at somebody and say, you're a bullshitter, or that's bullshit, right? It might be better not to drown them in all of this maxim talk, right? But to use the resources here to say, hey, look, man, you're giving us too much information. Can we just focus on this thing because that's what's helpful, right? To try and challenge that bullshitter. They'll know what you're talking about. Maybe you don't need to call them out explicitly as being a bullshitter. You can say, hey, look, can we please just focus on this and not on this other stuff that you're bringing in. I want to focus on, because that's more productive here, and that will prevent a bullshitter from bullshitting to the same extent and help make the conversation more helpful, restrict them from violating the norms that they're trying to violate, right? So that might help you out, right? Of course, when it comes to liars, right, and even bullshitters will often, as part of their bullshit, pretend to be concerned with the truth. Sometimes they freely admit, at least certain times, that they're not concerned about the truth. But most of the time, bullshitters will front that they are concerned with the truth. But when you call them out on it, they're much more likely than liars to not be ashamed of being, revealed as being mistaken or anything like that. They'll shrug it off, they'll move on to something else, right? So it can be harder to call out effectively a bullshitter with what you might think of as good evidence that they are not telling the truth to people. So that can be frustrating. It might be sufficient to call it out, to make the case to the other people in the discussion, hey, this guy has been feeding us some bullshit. They have been, talking about things that are not relevant. They have been saying way more than is necessary for the purpose, and they haven't even attempted to give us evidence for the thing that they're trying to claim is true, or the claim that they're trying to get us to believe. Look, and it hasn't improved. I've tried to kind of ask them for that stuff. They're still not respecting those norms of conversation, and you could use something a little bit less nerdy than norms of conversation, right? And say, look, I don't think this person is helping us out. Let's adjourn this. Let's all go talk ourselves. Right, exclude that person. Or if you guys don't want, I don't see anything productive in this, I'm walking away. I don't want to deal with this. That might be the way to deal with particular kinds of bullshit. But as a recap, right, I want to introduce just another term which I don't think gets introduced in the reading for this, and that is the term bad faith. You might have heard this term when people are talking about negotiations, contracts, or a sale or something like that, right? And people are, say, bidding on a particular object, right? You have the seller and the buyer, and the seller says, hey, this is worth this. That's what I'm selling it for. And then the buyer comes back to him and says, that's a little bit steep. How about this price? Or there's got a couple nicks on it. How about this price? And then the seller considers and maybe comes down with a bid in between. And that process right there is usually a good faith process. And what we mean by that is that both sides are legitimately looking for a resolution to the conflict, to the discrepancy, to the dispute, right? And they are being kind of maybe not honest with each other, right? Because the buyer in that situation might not really give a crap about the little nicks and scratches on the object, and that's just an excuse to try and lower the price of the object. That's fine. That's still something that in the norms of negotiating a price, we consider to be kind of a legitimate thing that people do, right? And so that's not bad faith. That's still good faith negotiation. Bad faith negotiation is when, an example of that would be when you're negotiating those two prices, they kind of get closer, and then as just about as you think you're ready to kind of settle on a mutually acceptable price, somebody moves the goalposts, right? And says, oh, I didn't notice this feature of the thing that you're trying to sell me. Oh, well, no, I couldn't possibly. And then they come back in with another and try and restart the negotiation to try and drag the seller's price down even more. Then that's maybe bad faith, because what that is doing is kind of invalidating everything that came before it, right? And bullshitters are often the thing that makes them norm breakers is that they don't have respect for those norms. They are not playing the same game, the game of communicating for mutual understanding. Bullshitters can be just, nope, I'm here just to F with you, right? Or I'm here to get you to do this or to have this attitude or perspective on the world. And so I'm saying whatever I think I need to say, no matter how many of those norms it violates, to try and get you or the other people in this group to think X, right? And so if someone lacks honesty and sincerity and those shared commitments to a mutual understanding, then they are communicating, if they're communicating at all, in bad faith. They have a different goal for that activity of talking than you do. And that often is just some straight up bullshit, right? So if this is another way of diagnosing when you're in a circumstance like that, and that we all kind of can sniff those situations out, sometimes, not perfectly, right? But that's what you should be on the lookout for, right? So in summary, bullshitters are people pursuing goals through the use of communication without any particular concern for the truth. They'll use it if it's useful for that other goal, but they are not interested in mutual understanding. They're interested in manipulation and getting what they want. And that can be very toxic to the project of thinking critically about stuff and being dedicated to a greater understanding, and not just persuasion for winning or manipulation, but persuasion to persuade people, including yourself, of the truth. That is, to come to a better understanding of the issue, right? Because they're not interested in the truth or conflict resolution or progress or understanding, it's inimical to real critical thinking. And this is why I said sometimes you don't want to just walk away, right? You want to engage with it and call it out, is because that can poison the environment for people who do hold those goals as important ones for that particular conversation activity. And that you might feel in yourself some obligation to stick it out and deal with the bullshit, not just for yourself, but for the other people involved who might not be as expert in critical thinking as you are becoming, right? So, like, one of the things about bullshit is that it's exhausting to deal with, because the bullshitter, as Frankfurt kind of notes, can be a kind of an artiste, right? And just kind of fling stuff around and have fun with what they're doing, because it's a creative, low stakes process for them. But if you are one of those people who is committed to truth and mutual understanding, you have some standards to keep, right? You have rigor and truth as expectations for yourself. And so responding to bullshit can be very time intensive, but maybe sometimes you're obligated to do that extra work for your community, for the other people in that discussion, to help teach them up, right? To help protect them from that particular instance of bullshit, but also to help teach them up so they're better prepared to identify and resist the bullshit in the future, right? I get paid to help you guys deal with bullshit, but lots of our work is unpaid work. And if you can manage to do it, if you're in that space, that privileged space, to have the time and energy left over to help teach up other people about bullshit, as a critical thinker, you do have that obligation to do it. All right, what's next? A highly related topic to this one, and that is trolls and trolling. As a distinctive, it's not super distinctive as the internet, but with the advent of the internet and social media, it's exploded. So topic number 8 is on trolls. So we'll see you there.